by, take one.
I tend to I tend to ask meandering questions because it's more of a conversation.
I'll probably give you meandering
Yeah.
answers.
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
All right, stand by. Camera.
All right.
Or sit by, as the case may be. Oh, let me get this pen out of my pocket. I have this nasty habit of always having an ink pen in my pocket.
I always say in it, writers, you actually working for Herm Revis, I was always told, carry a tape. And I took that to be translation, you always carry a pad and always carry a pen. They always said, Herm will ream your ass. Always walk fast and carry a tape, and he'll never ask where you're going. But if you're not, he'll say, what are you doing? Why am I paying you to do this?
Well, you know, one of the first things I was told when I was in the Army after I got out of basic training is always carry a clipboard, because if you carry a clipboard and walk fast, no brass will mess with you. They figure you got something to do, you know. So everybody, of course, everybody was carrying the clipboard, so I'm not sure how well it worked. You know.
This is great for the clipboard. If you're a clipboard manufacturer, you love it.
Absolutely, that's great.
When you're good, yeah. How did you get into the advertising game anyway, Larry?
I got into the advertising business by way of broadcasting. And I started in radio in 1966 as a rock and roll disc jockey. And then I realized when I got out of the Army that either I had to move around an awful lot to make more and more money, or maybe I could just migrate over to the advertising side of this business and I wouldn't have to move at all. And hey, I might even make more money than I was making in radio, which, by the way, I think I did. But anyway, that's how I got into it. I ran into a fellow broadcaster by the name of Marty Hall, who was a TV weatherman here in Roanoke for a while. And he said, let's start an agency. Isn't that how they all start? Let's start an agency. And I said, well, I guess that would be all right. So that's kind of how it started. But what I didn't get was that if you quit one occupation and go to another, you ought to leave the others behind. So I just kept building on this. So I left broadcasting, but I kept doing TV and radio, and I kept doing advertising and voiceovers and writing. And all of a sudden I had all these layers of stuff that I did for like 20 years. Lucky me. Greed is a terrible thing.
What did you like about advertising? What made you think of something you'd like to give a whirl?
I sort of like the freedom that came with owning an agency and working with people and having employees that I liked an awful lot. I think the freedom had a lot to do with it. And also, one of the things that I really did like was having done just broadcasting and specifically radio for a very long time. This gave me an opportunity to try some new media, to write for print and to write for TV and radio and public relations, press releases and what have you. So I got to expand out on what I was already doing. Wasn't sure I could do it, and I'm still not so sure.
How many people who passed through WROV ended up working in the agency business, and why do you think that is? Because that's not true if you look at WSLC, great station, tremendous station, and actually in the 60s, 70s, SLC had some of the strongest numbers overhead. Other than Bart, who was kind of on the boomerang end of it, K92 doesn't have that happen. But ROV had some of the most creative, amazing people, and more people came from ROV to end up in the agency business than probably all the other media combined.
You're right about that, and I'm not sure why it was, although for the longest period of time, ROV would win more awards, Addy Awards, for creative radio commercials than just about all of the agencies put together. And considering how many radio people went into the agency business, that's a little surprising, but they did. So I think there were an awful lot of really good production people that Bert Levine hired. They were very creative in the studio. And so they just naturally, when they migrated over into the advertising side, the agency side, they were in their element. I think that's why it happened. And yes, there were a lot of them. There was Jack Fisher, who ended up doing huge amounts of advertising here for his agency out of Richmond, handled big accounts with a secretary in himself. I don't know how he did it. McDonald's and Advance Auto Parts early on and what have you. There was Fred Freelance, who of course got together with a couple of other people and started his own agency. I think even, let's see who else. Of course, I did. Marty Hall did. I'm trying to think if there are any others, but I'm sure there might have been. But you're right, there was a disproportionate number of people that left that station.
Well, Bart, who was it? Bart and Fred Palmer did an agency for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were quite a few.
Although I think theirs was probably more of a production house, but yeah.
What did you tell me about the atmosphere at ROV and what it was like working for Bert? I hear so many people speak highly of him as a manager. What did you think of?
Bert Levine was like a father to me. He just was very encouraging, a very sharp, bright man, a very sweet man. I mean, he could sweep you out the front door real quick without, and he did plenty of that. But he was a good manager. He was a good owner to work for. He encouraged creativity, and at ROV it was back at the AM station. It was Bart Prater would take you. I always like to say Bart Prater would take you right to the edge of something being a little bit slightly dirty, but he'd never quite drop you over that edge. He knew exactly how far to take it. That it was very, very funny, and you knew darn well what he was saying, unlike today's jocks that would just go ahead and say it, because we weren't allowed to back in those days. And all of us guys sort of did that. I went on the air one morning. I did the morning show for about a year at ROV. I started out 7 to midnight, then I quickly went to mornings. And I did sort of a Billy Sol Hargis type of thing, or Reverend Billy, I called him. And I would do the preachy thing on the air, and we would sell prayer cloths and all sorts of stuff. And one morning, Bart Prater came in and dropped a cartridge in front of me. He says, "I think that Reverend Billy ought to run these songs that I've written." And they were hysterical. And I ran these things on the air. I got called into Bert Levine's office the next day, and he says, we had about 5 ministers called yesterday, very angry about this bit that you and Bart did. And he says, I think that you maybe just dropped right over on the non-tasteful side with this. And so I would just ask that you don't do that anymore. And I said, okay. And he said, that's all. And I got up to leave, and as I'm going through the door, he says, and by the way, Larry, and I turned around, he says, but it was really funny. That's the kind of guy he was.
Do any of those tapes survive?
Oh, and by the way, there's a very funny Bart Prater joke. Not joke, very funny Bart Prater story.
Okay.
Prater was always, as I said, very edgy with stuff he did on the air. And Budweiser was having a campaign. I think it was Bova Distributing was running the spots on ROV, and they were a big client, Bova Distributing was. And it was Ed McMahon, and I think it was like their 40th anniversary or 45th anniversary, and the tagline to the spot was Ed McMahon saying, 45 years and still going strong, keep it up, America. And Prater comes on and goes, keep it up, I can hardly keep it down. He was immediately called into, Don Fouts was the manager, into Don Fouts' office and says, do you know what you've just done to me? It's my biggest account, Bova Distributing. But he didn't get fired, but he came that close to getting fired. Bart always came that close to getting fired, but not quite. He was so good he couldn't be fired, if that's possible.
What year did you actually start your agency?
71.
How are things different? I mean, you're still running a successful agency today. How are things different from agency life in the early 70s to agency life in...
How you get things done and how much time you have to do it in. Those would be the two things that I would say. Remember back in the, I don't know whether you do or not, but back in the early 70s, if you were going to do a 4-color magazine ad, you probably need about 2 weeks from concept to photography to writing, and all the elements need to go, and then 4-color separation, which would take about 3 or 4 days. So you really had to back up, and then that all went away. All of a sudden you didn't need all that stuff anymore. Well, I mean, you still needed the concept, you still needed the copy, but you didn't need 4-color separations anymore. and you didn't need a lot of the going out to a printer to get the typeset and stuff like that. So all of a sudden, when a client said, I need it tomorrow, they always needed it tomorrow. But all of a sudden, now you're expected to deliver it tomorrow if you have to. And the technology is such that actually you can. That's been one of the big changes, how things get done. We started out fairly early on in the early 70s with, well, in the latter 70s, we added our own CompuGraphics, so we did our own in-house typesetting. So that would cut the time back, because we also handled a lot of retail accounts, and we were trying to squeeze that time between when an ad actually had to get there. And we always had our own in-house studio because of my work in radio, so that saved a lot. And we even did our own stats. We even had our own stat camera, so we had everything in-house except for 4 colors separation capability and printing. But it has changed an awful lot in that it just doesn't require the mechanical stuff it used to. It used to just kind of be big and clunky, and it would take a while. It was frustrating. You couldn't turn things around. It was like turning the Titanic around sometimes, you know. And today you can kind of, with a sharp bunch of people and, you know, the right thing going, you can turn that around pretty fast. It's mighty nice.
Yeah, I'll bet when they close up Associated, they threw away $20,000 worth of press time.
Oh, yeah, yeah. We gave away our CompuGraphics. We watched them. We waved them goodbye as they went out the driveway on the back of a truck. I think we gave them. One of them went to a newspaper in Martinsville, and another one went to college. Stat machines too. We just waved goodbye. All that money, all that equipment went away. Wasn't needed anymore.
What was the difference in the composition of clients? I was talking to, I think it's Webster's, you know, in the 70s, there were tons of community banks, and car dealers didn't go to national agencies. And if you hung out a shingle, you were going to get a car dealer, you were going to get a bank, you were probably going to get a hospital, because there were a number of 5 or 6 hospitals instead of 2. And then, you know, the consolidation has changed all that. But compare and contrast business in the business opportunities in Roanoke in the 70s versus the business opportunities.
Well, because of consolidation, most of the banks have gone away. We, for instance, we had our pet car dealers. We had 2 of them. We had a Ford dealership and we had a Dodge dealership. We specialized. How this came about, I don't know how. We just sort of accidentally fell. Nothing we did, by the way, was ever brilliant. We just accidentally sort of poked into it and fell into it and made it work. But for the longest period of time, we had like 5 savings and loans. Remember them? Well, you know, they were almost as good as a bank. And by the way, they, just like car dealerships, they paid their money, and they were great cash flow. Yeah, a lot of that because of the consolidation of clients and, you know, like car dealerships now are mega dealerships owned by one company. They own like 15 dealerships. We have some of those here. And all of that gets centralized somewhere else now. That is not an opportunity that exists here anymore. All the savings and loans went out of business. They became, you know, community banks and then stock banks and what have you. That's all gone away. So, yeah, there are an awful lot of things that we used to run after that's not out there anymore.
I remember when I forget, you may have been the ones who, you either got them or lost them. But I remember when Leatherhouse changed agencies. And that was a big deal. That was something we would buzz about in the community, you know?
Yeah, if you did a decent job and didn't try and stiff them on their bills, you probably could keep an account. I mean, we had accounts that we had for 27 years and accounts that we had for 25 years. And there were actually times where, of course, we also had accounts that lasted about 15 minutes. I'll have to admit, I got fired. Well, I have to tell you, just a year ago, I got fired from account after only 1 year, and that's happened so seldom in my life, and it really hurt. Even now, it still hurts, you know. But yeah, you used to could hang on to accounts for a long time, and if that account shifted to another agency, it was a big deal that people did talk about it. There was, you know, the ad federation, all the members and what have you, we used to drink and smoke together. I'm talking cigarettes, And we'd have a grand time, and we would really party hardy. But we were a very competitive bunch after we got out of that room, I can tell you. And yet we still all respected each other and had, even when and it didn't happen very often, somebody would steal somebody else's account. We always sort of had a gentleman's thing at our agency. We do not go after other people's accounts. However, if it's in play, then that's a totally different thing.
I'm gonna give- you need a break? Quick adjustment?
We doing all right?
You're doing all right. You're doing all right. Yeah, like I said, I will always remember Cooking Cheap. It's a shame there's not a box set out there somewhere,
Yeah, that was very funny.
That was
Do you have any idea how difficult it is to pitch a bank board of directors when they've seen you in a dress?
I gotta get that line again. I gotta get that. Can you lead in with a quick story about Laban and Larry and how you used to dress up? What was your character's name?
The Cook sisters.
Yeah.
Tootsie and Sister Cook.
And then close it with, do you have any idea how difficult it is to pitch a...
So, do you want me to tell you how the show came about, or what? Exactly.
Just a quick synopsis. Like, I had a cooking show on PBS with Laban Johnson. And
Oh, okay,
popular,
okay.
And we used to play the Cook Sisters.
Well, I'll tell you how that came about. Well, whenever you want me to do it. Oh, we're still rolling? Okay. Laban Johnson came to me in 1981, says, got an idea for a cooking show. And I said, well, we don't need any more cooking shows. Even in 1981, we didn't need, and there wasn't even a food channel. He says, oh, but you hear me out on this. This is a great idea. I said, well, what'll make it a different cook show than any other? He says, it's going to be a comedy cooking show with two guys. And he says, we're going to do just viewer recipes, and sometimes we'll just try them for the first time on the air. And if it works, fine. If it's a disaster, it's going to be a disaster just like it would be at home. And I think people would like the honesty of the show. We'll do it in real time from beginning to end with no stops, no edits. We only had two. Camera died one day. That was an edit. And a mic died one time. Other than that, the show was never edited. They did this, we did it beginning to end. And we would burn stuff and drop stuff on the floor, and sometimes the stuff was disgusting, and we would say so at the end of the program. This is a terrible recipe, don't try this. People thought it was funny. And I always said it was the most ideal television show in the world because you couldn't do any wrong. The worse you did on the air, the funnier people thought it was, and the more people watched. It was just amazing. So it built. So we were on the air for 27 years. 27 years. That's eternity in television. And we were on national syndicated satellite for 3 years. So we're seen all over the country, literally. But the TV station came to us one day. They were always irritated with us because we were stinking up the studio and there was smoke everywhere. So the management came to us one day and said, listen, this is public television, guys, and we don't think you impart anything to anybody worth a hoot. You're just playing this thing for laughs. And we said, well, people who watch public TV like to laugh too. And they said, well, yeah, but here's what we think. We think that you guys should have a little segment during the show where you impart some actual information to the viewer. And we said, well, that sounds kind of dull. And they said, well, think about it. So Laban and I sat down and we came up with the idea of doing it as two old ladies, the Cook sisters, based on people that we knew. My Aunt Tootsie Cook, my Aunt Tootsie who raised me, and his sister was her name. Sister was her name, actually. So it was Tootsie and Sister Cook. And we got in this horrible drag, old woman drag, strictly planned it for laughs. And we went back to the station and said that the Cook sisters are going to impart this bit of information in each show. The manager went, oh my God, why did we even ask? This is even worse. We should never have asked these guys to do this. So anyway, we did it. And so we did the Cook sisters forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And I used to say to my business partner, Marty Hall, when we would go to pitch a bank board of directors, I would say, do you have any idea what it's like knowing that they've seen me in a dress?
Of all the people you worked with,
Currently
Forever.
or forever?
Career, forever and ever. Amen.
Well, of course, I admired my business partner, Marty Hall, an awful lot because he was about everything you'd ever want to have in a business partner. He was funny, he was clever, he was the business guy, and I didn't have to do the facts and figures. I was the creative guy, and he pretty much left me alone. But I could still go to him for an idea, and he would come up with it. He was honest, and he was just a great fellow. There have been certainly a lot of others down through the years that I admired in this town. I thought that Claude Harrison, never got to know him very well. Jan Wilkins did, actually got to work for him, but I always admired Claude. He had a very classy agency, is what I remember. He had really good accounts. He did really good creative, as I recall, like Colonial American was like one of the first real campaigns from one media to another that was very well produced. He did his stuff on film, sets, real actors, and they looked good on television, they sounded good on radio, and they carried through well into print. They always did really nice print for Colonial American. And it was a real campaign from beginning to end. There were not a lot of people in Claude Harrison's day in this town that actually could afford to do what you would call a campaign that went through to all the media, billboard and print and magazine and newspaper and radio and TV, and he did that. And I always admired that about his agency. He had good clients and good creative.
That's a great answer. I'm going to give you a couple names, and I want you to just give me a sentence or two about the thing I remember about X or X was or some fill in the blank was. First name Freddie Freelance.
Just completely batshit.
Started out with the
Fred Freelance.
Hold on 1 second. I'm panning while you do that, so give me a beat and take it.
Fred Freelance was batshit crazy and an awful lot of fun and just a heck of a nice guy. I liked him, and he was just a party guy. But, Fred had that little whispery voice, and he did those Lindy's commercials way back when I first came here in '71. And I never got to know Fred real well, but I always enjoyed being around him because he was a million laughs, a lot of fun.
All right. John Will Creasy.
I did not know John well.
Okay.
I met him a couple of times, but I didn't know him.
I didn't know if you know
No.
him or not. Let's see here. Who's some of the other? Jan Wilkins.
Well, I have to be careful what I say about Jan because I think he's still a friend. Our paths have crossed an awful lot down through the years. Jan's a very creative guy. I always tell Jan that he thinks he lives in a perfect world and he needs to get over it, that he laughs. He likes for everything. He's a real perfectionist. But he's a good copywriter. He started out writing copy at WROV. He went to Channel 10. He wrote commercials for them. And then he was the forwarding guy for Holiday on Ice, Ice Follies. And while he didn't do any writing for that, he was still in charge of their PR and all of that. And then he went to Claude Harrison and worked for him for a while. Just an overall good guy as far as advertising is concerned.
You've got a pretty wide swath in.
You think?
In your career, how do you think the talent level in Roanoke stacked up with the talent level now? The people say if you're going to make it, you got to work in New York. But I've always felt like we've had people here that are every bit as good. How do you feel the talent level has been here? What do you think?
I think the talent level of all creative in this town has just gotten better as years have gone by. And you know what? We've had a legendary radio station that was 1,000 watts a day and 250 at night. People knew ROV AM all over the country. It was legendary. We've had agency work here that's gone far and wide and been respected. I can tell you that I used to, and I got out of this pretty quickly. Somehow I got on this list of judges that have to go to judge other AEF daddy competitions. Found myself in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Don't ever send me back there. I hope nobody is from Scranton. But anyway, what I discovered when I did some of those, I also did one down in North Carolina. I can't remember exactly where, but it gave me an opportunity to see, make a comparison point to the Roanoke creative. And I'll tell you what, we were all almost usually heads above markets like that. Fort Bragg, what is this city down there? Yeah, I went down and judged the Fayetteville Addy Awards one year, and they almost wouldn't let us come home. They actually called us back from the hotel, and they says, you know what? You're going to give some more awards, or you ain't leaving here. We said, but we don't think anybody else deserves any awards. And they says, yeah, you do. We think you will. So we had to come back and redo the radio and the print and what have you. But it was slim pickings. Maybe it was just a bad year. I'm sure just a bad year. But same thing with Scranton, Pennsylvania. Back to the point that I never felt like Roanoke was ever on. I always felt that Roanoke was above those markets even in creative. I always thought Roanoke was pretty good creatively. There have been better years and worse years, but I think it's just gotten better as time's gone on.
Why do you think it's important for a community? We're a mid-sized city, and there's nothing wrong with that. But why do you think it's important for a town like Roanoke to have a good group of engaged creative people?
Well, I don't think it matters what kind of creative you're talking about, if you're talking about the arts or if you're talking about advertising, and maybe they're both the same sometimes. I just think that it's pride of workmanship, and everybody likes to have that. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that we have a good work ethic here, and I think we have creative people, and it's a pleasant enough place to work, and that's why it's all important.
You said that you had a couple notes. You got most of my questions taken care of. What did you make a note of that you thought was
I just made Valleydale was another campaign.
Actually, it's one that I'd love to ask about. Tell me about local advertising campaigns that you remember and you thought had good impact.
One of the campaigns that is still around to this day to some degree, not quite as prevalent as it used to be, is the Valleydale campaign. And it's fascinating because of its history. Its history started when the animated pigs were done by the Walt Disney Studio at a time when they needed business, and so they were willing to do stuff for just about anybody. I have no idea what Valleydale paid them, but I'm sure it was a good price even then. They've certainly gotten their use out of them animated pigs because they're still dancing to this day, not as often as they used to. But one of the things that I always thought was fascinating was there was a combination of the jingle, which was very dated but still fun now in a retro sort of way. There was the animation, which also transferred well over to the print. And as a campaign, I always thought it held together pretty well, and I think it still does.
That's one of my favorites. It just sticks in your head. You know?
And yeah, it's a little hokey around the edges, but you know what? It's kind of fun because, as I said, it's now so old and hokey. It's actually retro. Which I will tell you one other quick story. I handled for the longest period of time. I handled Fuel Oil and Equipment Company, which no longer exists. They're now part of the PMI group. But Bill Kirk was just a fun guy to work with. Just full of piss and vinegar. And so I went to Bill one day and I said, Bill, I have your jingle from the 1950s for Fuel Oil and Equipment Company with a Diamond Exchange being sung at the end of it, Diamond 63338 or whatever it was. He says, you do? I said, yeah. I said, I have it in my studio. I have it in my file. How'd you get that? I said, well, I used to have radio stations give me those little 3-inch tapes so I could roll the tape off of them and use the spools to send back out to the radio stations. And I said I came across that jingle on one of them one day, probably from WSLC radio, I would imagine. And I said, I kept it. He said, I think we ought to do a retro campaign using that old jingle. I said, okay. So I wrote this retro campaign, had a lot of fun with it, put the thing together. And I went to him and I says, now, you're going to have to pay me $1,000 for the jingle. And he says, that's outrageous. It's my jingle. I said, but did you have it? And he said, no. I said, I think I have the only copy of it that exists. And I said, let's just say it's for, let's just say that it's for putting it on the shelf for a couple of years. I have maintained it for you. And yes, I'm charging you $1,000. And he, to this day, when I run into him, says, you shook me down for my own jingle. I can't believe you did that. And I did.